Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Right Talk Wednesday. I'm your host, Kit Kilstow, and I'm here with Frances Billinghurst, who is an author who lives in the Southern Hemisphere. So there may be just a little bit of a delay on the video, but we've got it covered. And we're going to talk today about her writing. She is a metaphysician, an energetic healer, an author, an explorer of the mysteries, and it sounds like we're going to have a lot in common and a lot to talk about. She's a prolific author of a number of books that focus around connecting with the natural cycles, utilizing myth to enhance our human existence and working magic into our lives. And that also fits in with the themes of the authors we've been talking about this season on Right Talk Wednesday. So thank you. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here and to share our discussions with your audience.
Great. Well, I see you've got a few of your books on the shelf behind you as well. But why don't you go ahead if you want to and tell our listeners and our viewers just a little bit more about yourself.
Okay, so just sort of expanding from my introduction. Yes, I was born in New Zealand. I now live in Australia, and I live in the southern part of Australia. So if you are familiar with our continent, which is the same size as the US, I live in Adelaide. So basically right in the middle, right down the bottom, and there's nothing between us and Antarctica. So our winters, we get that southerly wind straight up, and it can get really cold. And it was because of this, and I suppose embracing an earth-centric sort of spiritual path, that basically since I stepped onto the path, noticing that a lot of our information was Northern Hemispheric based. So my first book, which is Dancing the Sacred Wheel, is basically explaining how we did things down under, so to speak. And it sort of snowballed from there. I think Dancing the Sacred Wheel is still one of the few books that are solely dedicated to the Southern festivals, the 8 spokes of the sacred wheel that we use within the craft. But what I've actually done is sort of combined the Northern Hemispheric myths that are associated with each of the seasons and each of the festivals, and put them into our dates, and also included at the time, because the book's been out nearly 15 years, a little bit of local Aboriginal traditions and law. And I think this is the big emphasis of the book. And for anybody else who is interested in following what we call the Wheel of the Year, the 8 season or festivals, and you don't sort of fit into the English-centric one, is to look to your Indigenous peoples, look to your land, and you can actually gain a lot more from nature. So that was the book that kicked off everything, that also sort of combined my interest in earth-centric spirituality. I've also had a deep interest in mythology. Both my parents were readers. My dad still reads a lot. My mother was a librarian as well. And I had a big fascination with the Arthurian myths, Morgan Le Fay. As I got older, this sort of merged into how to utilize these myths as more than just stories, but were they sort of remnants from our ancestors in explaining how things happened in the world, like the Aesop fables that we may be familiar with, which have sort of a moralistic story to them. Are the myths something along those lines as well, as a way of sort of explaining why things happen in our life and how we can move through or even look out for these instances? So that was that interest, and it sort of combined in with everything else I do in the metaphysics, because I believe that we're more than just this physical shell. There's more aspects to us and our connection with nature and other people. And when we begin to realize that there's more to us than just this physical being moving through our day-to-day mundane world, we get to see the magic that happens all around us as well, and also within us, with really amazing creatures of what we can achieve.
Oh, I
Am I-
love all of that. Oh, I just it,
Sorry, I could have gone on forever, but I thought I'd pause.
no, that's okay. That's great. I just have to touch on the first part because you're so correct that a lot of the nature spirituality, a lot of the pagan polytheist work out there is very northern hemisphere oriented. And I know, so for those who are tuning into us, when we're celebrating Yule here in the northern hemisphere, December 21st, that's your midsummer.
Midsummer, yes. And we've just gone through your Halloween, which is, I don't know, I could be old and grumpy around this time of the year because everybody's running around doing Halloween here. And it's just like when you're following an earth-centric sort of tradition, following the sun and the earth, we're coming into summer. So that's Beltane. This is, the sacred union of the masculine and feminine. So it is sort of that celebration of the sort of renewal of life, as opposed to, I know Halloween is different to Samhain, but over here we've got this huge sort of corporation or consumerism angle to Halloween. Everybody's running around in their plastic everything. So of course, I suppose being a little bit of a greenie as well, I'm just thinking about the microplastics getting into our waterways, which begins to irritate me. So I get really grumpy. And I did make a couple of videos this year, how I'm noticing, and it could be just the logarithms that we have with social media. Everything's driven by social media and logarithms these days. But everything that I was seeing on my feeds was very Halloween. And I said, there's nothing wrong with Halloween, but there's nothing mentioned about Samhain or Beltane. And that's what we sort of felt like we're drowning, over here. So this time of year I can get very grumpy, but that's all right. We've moved on. Our sun is increasing and we're looking forward to midsummer.
No, I can see how that would make you very grumpy. That would make me grumpy too if I was in that situation. Now I'm grumpy because everything's all Christmas and I'm like, oh, for Pete's sake, give me a break. But
Oh, we get that too. We get our spray cans of fake snow because we're in midsummer. We don't have snow. We have gentlemen or volunteers dressing up in these heavy red suits and fake beards to, children don't sit on their knees anymore, to do, Santa Claus or Father Christmas. And I'm thinking it's going to be 42 degrees Celsius. I don't know what, I think that's close to 100 Fahrenheit soon. And I feel really sorry for them.
yeah, yeah, and it does. I mean, it really gets to the heart of how our modern society, and I sense we could do a whole show about this. So I don't want to sidetrack us too much, but it really feels like how our Western culture has really disconnected itself from the environment and from nature because there's no arbitrary reason why you should have people dressing up as Santa Claus right now.
No,
No.
nor I don't know if the same thing happens in America, but I know from beginning of January we get some of our supermarkets selling us hot cross buns for Easter, and I'm going, hang on, be very stale. So it's gone like festivals, especially the seasonal based ones, have gone very commercialized, and it's just like sort of like sucked all the essence out of them, shall I say, which is part of what I sort of what happens when you're following earth-centric traditions or even being connected back with our earth. And I think that sort of flows on to the world that we live in, how everything is sort of on a very commercial level, and we're feeling the results of being so disconnected, which
hmm
is probably one of the reasons that continues or encourages me to keep writing not only the books, but everything else, is to remind people, even like the sacred stories, as we were talking about right at the beginning with the myth, all that connects us back to the land, back to the here and now, back to what I call the sacred.
Very much so. And you made my segue for me because I was just thinking that those myths, to me, really connect us to ourselves as well, that um, within my own personal tradition, being a polytheist, I see the deities that I work with as being different aspects of humanity and kind of archetypes of that. And so I would love to hear more about how mythology and how our stories kind of help work that magic into our own lives.
Oh, yes. And I think everybody has a different slant to it. And I think this day and age, it's really important to just remind ourselves that what I say you may not disagree with, and that's okay. And I think this is the whole beauty of these myths. A lot of them are interpretations and have been coming down through the millennium, a lot of them, where some of them are fragmented, and depending on the mindset or the lens that the interpreter was looking at the time, their own sort of, say, prejudices or limitations depends on the story of the myth that we see today. And this is quite evident in the work. I think Kate is one in particular, and I think Charlene Specknack, it's her name, she's an English writer and feminist researcher. I think it's either Hecate or Persephone. And she did, I think it might be actually been Persephone, who goes into the underworld. And the more familiar myth that we have is that she was abducted by Hades and taken in there. And then basically when she gets released and comes back up, she'd eaten the 3 pomegranate seeds or 6 pomegranate seeds. That in itself, depending on where you live, can relate to the different sort of seasons or how long winter is it 6 months or 3 months? But I think Charlene and her interpretation of the story is that she gave an alternative understanding that Persephone heard the crying of the deceased or the wandering soul. So she volunteered to go down there. I'm not saying either story is right or wrong. It just sort of gives us a different interpretation and also a sort of widening up to how we can approach this myth from a number of different angles. And because with Persephone's story, it's very seasonal, and there were a lot of seasonal stories at that time. It talks about the end of winter, and then the fallow time, which is when Demeter, her mother, goes into mourning. And then when Persephone rises again, all life comes back to the earth because mother and daughter are united. But when you're looking at the story, say, from a more humanistic angle, it's one of sort of separation and self-identity of the maiden, of Kore, or who became Persephone. Because before at the beginning of the story, as I'm quite sure your listeners and your readers are probably very familiar with the story. But at the beginning, Kore, Persephone, was basically just known as, Kore means maiden. So she wasn't a person in her own aspect. She was an aspect of her mother. And she had to go into the sort of underworld journey where she became the queen of the underworld. She stepped into her own role. She stepped into her own power, whether she was abducted or whether she did it voluntarily. This may upset a few people, but to me, it's almost neither here or there. The important aspect was her stepping into her power. Mm-hmm. So taking that chance, or even going through what some people call a dark night of the soul if she was abducted, and her rise and her embracing those experiences, those traumas, and things don't sort of work out in big cosmic plan, and stepping into her own power, making the most of the situation and rising up again. Did she purposely take the 3 seeds because she wanted to return to not being in her mother's shadow, or was she forced or tricked into eating those 3 seeds? This is a sort of a question that's never really answered in any of the myths or any of the interpretations that I have read, and I find that really interesting. What if the knowledge that she gained while she was in the underworld, she realized that when she emerges back up again, she could be back in her mother's shadow again. So she took the three seeds so she can continue with that cycle of being a woman in her own power or a person in her own power. Almost, so it's almost like a bit of a heroine's journey, so to speak, if we're looking at sort of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, but this is a woman's journey of emerging into her own right and not just being married off to Hades. She is known as the queen of the underworld in her own right. So very powerful story for us to sort of look at and take on board, I think.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, I very much agree. Some good friends of mine actually gifted me the book. It's on my to be read list, The Heroine's Journey, to look at, to have some sort of counterpart to that hero's journey. To yeah, so I very much agree with that, and I feel that there's, however you go to it, whether you get there through psychology, through Jung's archetypes, through mythology, that there's self-examination, and that's where you find your magic. I always tell people I'm a storyteller because I'm always about writing stories and examining stories and what stories we tell ourselves. And I feel like mythology helps us to do that. It helps us to examine the stories we tell ourselves, or the stories, especially in Greek and Roman mythology, the stories that really underpin our Western culture.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more, because our Western culture stems basically from the Greeks and the Romans. And my other interest is ancient Egypt, and this is where I sort of have interest in there's a more metaphysical viewpoint of ancient
Mm-hmm.
Egypt, because what people tend to overlook is that the ancient Romans and Greeks in particular came to Egypt first to learn their knowledge, then took it back. And then it's like, where did the ancient Egyptians learn their knowledge from? We don't know. But that's another rabbit hole to fall down anyway. But coming back to the myths, I think in our modern world, we have devalued them. We just pass them off as stories with no purpose and meaning. But when we look at how old they are and their purpose as to how they were told and why they were told, they were sort of explaining the world around them. As I said, like the Aesop fables. So there is always a deeper meaning under and in them, even when the stories have been built upon over the centuries. And one myth in particular, as I mentioned in the beginning, my interest in Arthurian legend is watching characters such as Morgan le Fay, and she's a fairy queen, how she evolved over the centuries. And I do have just a mini plug in my Dark Goddess book. I've included a story of her in there because I see her as this very lost creature that we see today. Back in the 11th century or even before, where she first appears, she was one of the fairy queens, the leader of the healers on Avalon, which is Glastonbury today, that took the body of King Arthur to be reborn. And then over the centuries, and what we see today through R.G. Thomas Malroy's interpretations, even in the, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, there was a television show, Mists of Avalon,
Mm-hmm.
based on the book, and I love it. I know the book is a little bit controversial, or the author is a little bit controversial these days, but the television depiction, where she was raising the arms and to part the mist, beautiful gestures. But Morgan these days appears to be very disconnected to her role as the heir of the High Priestess of Avalon. She's disconnected to her family in relation to Tintagel, which is actually her castle, but she sort of turned away from that. And for some reason, depending on interpretation, and this is just how I see it, she wanted, due to her pining for her unacquainted love for Lancelot, become a handmaiden or a servant to King Arthur, who's her half-brother, his wife Guinevere, and they hated each other, or she hated her, Morgan. So why would you continue putting yourself in that situation? So I see her as a dark goddess, and I see her story as these big lessons as to trying to figure out why we disempower our own selves. And again, as you mentioned, giving us the opportunity to sit down and are we wasting our energy, our time, our life on our unacquainted love? Now, this could be a love of a person or a situation or an idea that isn't going to happen. And we need to sort of revalue ourselves, because Morgan didn't. And she ended up being very sort of shrinking to what she originally was, both in the telling of the story over the centuries, but even in the latest myth that we have, she's a shadow of the person that she could have been if she actually realized what her purpose is in life and took that chance.
That's such a powerful story and a powerful reminder for all of us to think about how we think about these stories. I would love for you to tell us more about the books that I see there on your shelf. Can you talk more about your writing?
Oh, certainly. I did mention Dance in the Sacred Wheel. Oh, very good to fall off the shelf. So this is the first book that I said I wrote. It's about the festivals in the Southern Hemisphere, and it was basically to counteract, or to counterbalance, I should say, all the Northern Hemispheric books that we had at the time. And an artist friend of mine sort of did the cover. So these are all photos of rituals and celebrations my group had done over the years. So, and I suppose this is about the third edition now. I keep expanding it as more information comes to hand as well. And at the time, I was writing for sort of a metaphysical New Agey magazine called Insight. It folded it like a lot of magazines do, probably about 2010 or something. And I was writing, it was a monthly magazine, writing a column on mythology and earth-centric spiritualities and bring the magic back into our lives. And when the magazine folded, I looked at the myth that I had written, and In Her Sacred Name was the result of some of those myths. I've got 13 goddesses in particular that I sort of expanded the stories on and have like little mini sort of rituals and meditations and things. So for people wanting to sort of connect with the divine feminine, they can do so. Or this is probably a good starting point, In Her Sacred Name. Then at that time, a male friend of mine was complaining that there are hardly any books for men. Everything was very goddess-centric, and for women, and what about men? So the next book came Call of the God, which is my first anthology, because I have written for a number of other anthologies, but this is the first one that I had edited for Call of the God, an anthology exploring the divine masculine within modern paganism. So it's got artwork and poetry and photos from a wonderful friend in England, contributions from all around the world, all both from men and women, and all genders in between, wanting to connect with the masculine within paganism, but within spirituality as a whole, in a more positive way than what I suppose for people coming from a Christian background may be a little bit more toxic. And it was interesting to see what gods were the more popular gods when this book. So this was 2010, 2011 that I did the call out for, and I think 2014 or 15 was when I was doing the final press for this book to come out. So it was interesting to see at that time what gods were more popular than others. And Hern, Woden, also antlered horn gods definitely were more of the popular deities. And these books I've all self-published myself. We don't have a lot of publishers here for esoteric books in Australia, probably based on the fact that our population isn't all that great. So my next book, I actually approached an English publisher called Moon Books. And for the last, since 2006, I do have a fascination and interest in dark goddess myths. I have an interest in psychology as to why we do things. And I think a lot of this stems from me trying to understand myself, my place in the world, and also, especially these days, you look at things happening going, what's going on? And I come back to the stories, and encountering the dark goddess is looking at 13, and I'll go so-called dark goddesses, because a lot of people sort of wonder why I've got Morgan Le Fay in there, for the reason I've just explained. So in this book, I talk about my concept of the dark goddess, because there are many interpretations out there. I also talk through my interpretation of shadow work, which is very popular these days. I do find that while it's good to sort of know what triggers you, it's the next steps to how we're going to take that knowledge on board and how we're then going to use that to improve our lives and move forward. And this is one story both with Persephone, but also Inanna's descent, who's a Mesopotamian goddess. However, I don't do Inanna's descent is in this book, but I do it from Ishkragul point of view. Ishkragul is sort of Inanna's nemesis, shall we say. It's Ishkragul's underworld that Inanna comes into, and all the interpretations that are often around are from Inanna's story. We don't hear a lot about Ishkragul as to how she may have felt having her sister turn up to witness the funeral rites of her own husband. And there's a lot of backstories in there. So like with all the 13 goddesses in this book and also in her sacred name, I work with deity as in connecting with them as sort of like spiritual beings, or going a little bit more deeper than archetypes. I sort of like Godhead in a way. So there's meditations and rituals and other things connected with us, connecting to our sort of shadowy aspect and why that is important. And I sort of also give an outline throughout the book of my own descent into the darkness and the gifts that are in there. I think that's the important thing. Yes, like how on the cover, it can be confronting, it can shake us, upset us, change our life completely. But we were talking about disconnection of nature. I think a lot of us in the West were also disconnected from our spirit, our true source, whatever we want to term that out. That could be internal, that could be external. And we need to go through these big sort of soul shifts every now and then to bring us back into awareness, into alignment, without sounding too woo and out there, with and stop thinking more about our own isolated little box that we tend to live in. And I think the dark goddess does that. Then just to add another book on witchcraft to the mix, I had been asked to write a book by a number of people in my circles, so I wrote Contemporary Witchcraft. And again, it's different to witchcraft that we see today, which a lot is about spell casting. Nothing wrong with that, but I see it as a religion, as a spiritual practice where, again, I call in God, goddess. I also see it as a journey to transform, improve ourselves. So this is where we sit in our meditations. This is where we sort of, a lot of it is self-analyzing going within. So all these things are sort of coupling and marrying up. And then my last book is yet another book on the moon, so on her silver rays. And you may have guessed, I sort of don't do subjects lightly. I dive in really deep. So on her silver rays sort of is about working with the moon, but more than just manifesting with the new moon and say banishing at the waning moon. It's diving into our own personal changes as the moon changes, because the moon does affect us psychologically, psychically, on so many different levels. and also what we sort of notice in the world around us. So again, it's sort of reconnecting us back to the moon that has a huge influence in our life and on our planet. I also include mythology and some rituals and other techniques about how to really focus on the moon to bring about true change as opposed to acquire external things. I do think that we have everything within us. We are just distracted by looking externally all the time. And when we sort of like stop for a moment and do that self-reflection and stop becoming the mass consumer, this is me getting a little bit greeny again, then we realize that we don't need all that stuff. Yes, it's good to have the latest smartphone or iPhone these days. We sort of need to in a society where we need to, but do we need to upgrade every 6 months or a year, or looking at our footprint? I know this is sort of a little bit controversial, but I think it's more important, coming back to the earth, coming back to our environment, coming back to our place in the big cosmic web. And I think this is another thing that our consumerism is sort of distancing us from the understanding that we are not isolated. Our actions ricochet out and ripple out and affect everything, everyone around us. And the more that we disconnect ourselves, we're actually harming ourselves. And so I'm not a trained psychologist. I wonder how there's an increase in, say, ADHD and isolation and even anger from people these days that we see in our world, if that's not stemming really from our disconnection to our environment and basically to our spirit, from it to our soul. That's a little bit long-winded about my books, but that's sort of coming back to what inspires me to write them.
Oh, no, I appreciated that. Like so many of my guests, I get the feeling that we could probably talk for hours, but alas, our time is coming to a close today. Um, I do always like to ask, is there something that you wanted to mention about your writing that we haven't had a chance to discuss, or was there something that you wished I would have asked that we didn't, or?
Really good question. I don't have I do have a project sort of in the back burner, but it's in a very distant back burner because I am sort of working on conference and doing online courses and doing video content for my YouTube channel, because that's what we have to do these days. But I do have the sort of approach to my writing that how it sort of affects other people. And as I said, I don't, whether people agree with me or not, to me, that's not the important thing. Or I sort of am interested in if it makes people sort of stop and think for a moment, and then you can form your own opinions with it. So it's stopping and thinking as opposed to just blindly following on, that I think is an important aspect to any sort of media writing when we're getting that message out, is to pause, because we're in the world where it's almost automatic and we do things automatically, but we need to sort of stop every now and then, think, observe where we are, coming back to our body and our place. And if that's echoing through my books, fantastic. If it's echoing through someone else's books, that's fantastic. But it's coming back and taking ownership too. So yes, there's faults in these books, but I'm still very proud of them. And I am grateful for everybody who bought a copy over the years, who've listened to me telling my few cents worth.
Well, that is a wonderful place to close up our show today. And again, just so our listeners and viewers know, there will be links to your website, to your YouTube channel, to everything in our show notes. So we always encourage everybody to go like, subscribe, follow, do what you need to do to keep us all afloat these days. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciated the time, especially with the time difference between us, that you took to have this conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Kit. And thank you, well, for inviting me and yes, putting up with my rants. It's been a joy.
Wonderful. Thank you.